So what I want to do today is talk about two things. One is I want to talk about the project that I'm currently working on, or that's kind of my starting point. And then I want to use that as an opportunity to talk about one of the larger issues that interests me in Russian history. So I want to start off with how I got to this current topic, because to me it's kind of a fun story, and other historians will be able to appreciate this. So Mike was talking about my book Enlightened Metropolis, which is a history of the city of Moscow in the 18th and 19th century. And one of the big events in Moscow in that period was the invasion by Napoleon. And so in the early 2000s, I was in Moscow, I was doing research on this, and archivists, I was at this archive, and archivists there showed me a manuscript that had been written by a German language writer about his experience. This is what the cover of it looked like. That's the title in English, about his experience in Moscow during the occupation by Napoleon, when the entire city was occupied and then burned. It was an interesting manuscript. This author describes his experiences, but I had no idea who he was. And that often happens in archival research. You come across someone interesting, you don't know who it is. But then 2 years later, I was back in Moscow, and I was at this ugly archive at the other end of the city, looking at completely different sets of documents. And I came across this thing here on the right, which was a letter written by clearly the same person. Because he describes, this is the original German text, this is this Russian text. It clearly describes the same events. This had to have been the same person, and this time it had a name. The previous one didn't have the author's name, this one does. And now often when you archival research, you find an interesting person, but then you learn nothing more about it. This guy, it turned out, his man's name was Rosens, and I was able to learn all sorts of things about him. And in particular, what I learned, I'm going to give you a really rough outline. So this is what he looked like. These are the only images, likenesses that exist. This is him in his early 60s. He was a pastor at that point. And based on this painting, this engraving was made. So this is the only idea we have of what the man would have looked like in his lifetime. So Rosenstrauch, here roughly is his story. Really quickly, he was born in the southeast of Germany. As a young man, he became a barber surgeon. A barber surgeon does what this guy here does. A barber surgeon would pull teeth, sew up wounds, set broken bones, and shave men's beards, cut your hair. So he's a combination of surgeon and barber. He did that for a couple of years, and then he became a traveling actor. So he worked with traveling acting companies, and was in various parts of Germany and Holland, other parts of Germany. And then he was born in 1768. So he was born in 1768. In 1804, in his 30s, he emigrated to Russia. And in Russia, the Russian part of his story is what I'll tell more about. But in Russia, he becomes first also an actor. Then eventually he becomes a merchant. That's why he's in Moscow during Napoleon's invasion. Then later on he becomes a pastor. That's why you saw him before in his pastoral vestments. He was an important Freemason. So this is someone who lived in many places and had an interesting life. And I thought, this is an interesting story. You have to write a book about this. But how do you frame a book like this? Right? I wouldn't want to write a biography, because a biography usually is about someone who somehow changed history. And this guy didn't change history. He's not an important person in that way. And so the genre that I hit upon is something called microhistory. So what microhistorians do, right, is a term, they're not little people. They write about little subjects. What the term microhistory refers to is a style of historical scholarship where you take a person who is not someone who changed history. But what you do with this person is you try to explore a time period. You say, how can this person tell us something about that era? So for instance, I'm teaching, and often the issue that what you're interested in is an issue in the world of the past that connects with our time today. So for instance, at my institution at Notre Dame, I'm currently teaching a seminar about microhistories, and here too the books we're reading. Right, this one is about a man in the 16th century who moved from North Africa to Italy, converted from Islam to Christianity, and then eventually converted back to Islam. He's a very interesting figure, and he helps us think about connections between the Christian world and the Muslim world, which of course is very relevant in our own society. This book right here is about an executioner in the 16th century who kept a journal of his executions. And it's a fascinating book about the 16th century. It also gets you thinking about criminal justice, about law and order. If you think of our debates today about police brutality and mass incarceration. In other words, what both of these books do is they take an obscure person, tell a story about a time period, and highlight issues that really connect with our own time also, that are not just issues from that era. And so I thought, okay, I have to do something like this. So what I'm doing with Rosens, who's my man, is I've developed certain contexts for him, and I briefly want to tell you what those are. One context is generally the modern context of migration. Right? Obviously, Rosens was a migrant because he was a German who moved to Russia. And of course, migration is one of the big issues of our time. Right? And what happens to people when they move from one country to another country, and how are they received, how are they treated, how do they integrate themselves, and so forth. And a second issue is Russia in particular. That is, Russia today, where kind of ethnic things are concerned, Russia presents a certain paradox. And the paradox is this. In a certain way, Russia is a very multi-ethnic place, and ethnically very inclusive and very tolerant. So for instance, if you go to Moscow and you visit Victory Park, right? Victory Park is a huge memorial complex that commemorates the Second World War. And the Second World War, I think it's fair to say, is the biggest thing that ever happened in all of Russian history, as far as most Russians are concerned. And so this is a thing of enormous significance. There's lots of museums, but there are also religious shrines. And specifically, there are three of them. There's an Orthodox church, a Jewish synagogue, and a Muslim mosque, because the government's view is these are the three big historic religions of Russia, and so they all need to be represented. And this is indicative of a broader pattern in Russia of recognizing that this is a multi-ethnic society, and the different ethnic and religious groups need to be respected. On the other hand, if you follow Russian foreign policy at all, you also know that Russia is a big supporter of nationalist, anti-globalizing movements in the West. Right? Wherever you get a Western political organization that's trying to undermine the global order and promote ethnic nationalism, like Marine Le Pen in France, for example, usually the Russian government has its finger in that. So there's a kind of paradox, right? Where does this Russian way of thinking about nationality come from? Right? That on the one hand, the country is multi-ethnic. On the other hand, there's a deep distrust of globalism. And now, if you take these ideas about today, about migration and about Russia and ethnic diversity, it takes you back to the 18th and 19th century. And it does me anyway, because I'm a historian. I study the 18th and 19th century. And if you look back, one of the things you see is Russia in the 18th century was a big country for immigrants. If you were a European and you wanted to migrate to another country, Russia was one of the places you went, just like America was a place that you went. So that was true in the 18th century and in the early 19th. But then after the early 19th century, that dried up. Right? When you have the big waves of European migration from the 19th century to the First World War, very few of those went to Russia. Almost all of them went to, especially the United States or other places in the Americas. So what happened? Right? What changed in Russia from the 18th century to the 19th century? And what this has to do with, right, what changed, the thing that happened, has to do with how we think about what it means to be a nation and what it means to be an empire. And that's going to be one of my big themes. The distinction I want to make here is this, right, that if we are a nation, that is, we think of ourselves as a nation, what that means is we think that all of those who live in our country form one people. And we have some sort of connection with each other. That's what makes us a nation, is that we have this bond, or we, in our minds, we have a bond with each other. What makes you an empire is that the people don't have that sense of a bond with each other, but there's a ruler. And this ruler is guiding the empire in a certain direction. The people's job is to support what the ruler is doing, but the people don't have to have a bond with each other. So people in Britain and in India didn't have a bond with each other in the 19th century. But they're all part of the British Empire, where the British government is guiding all of them in a certain direction. So modern societies can be more nations or more empires. And what happened in Russia with immigration and what happened in Russia with ethnicity has a lot to do with how empire and Russia and nation played out. And Rosenstrauch's life, right, this man I'm interested in, Rosenstrauch's life can help you think about how these things worked. So what I want to do now is tell you a few things about his life, and as we follow his movements in Russia, look at what those movements tell us about Russia as a place of empire and of ethnic diversity. So remember in 1804, right, he'd been in Europe, in various places in Germany. In 1804, at this point he's 36 years old, he takes a ship and he sails to St. Petersburg, which at that time is the capital of Russia. So he arrives in St. Petersburg, and what he does in St. Petersburg, his reason for being there is to be an actor. Right, so this is what St. Petersburg looked like. This is the capital of the Russian Empire. He arrives there to be an actor. Right, he was an actor in Germany. There's a German language theater in St. Petersburg. Rosenstrauch arrives to be an actor in this theater. What happens when he arrives in Petersburg is he discovers Russia as an empire. So I also want to say a few things about Russia as an empire. So Russia was a multi-ethnic state, right, with many different languages and nationalities. The goal of the Russian Tsars was to make Russia into a great European power. The purpose of everything that the Russian government did was to promote that. So the Russian government did not particularly foster a sense of bonds among the population of the empire. What they fostered was the idea that everybody has an obligation to do their part to help the Russian Tsars make the empire into a great European power. Ethnic foreigners had an important role in that. Right? Ethnic foreigners, people as ethnic Europeans, people coming from Europe, had a special role in advancing Russia's development as a European power. And ethnic Germans in particular were part of that, and that's why Rosenstrauch is here. So what Rosenstrauch discovers in Russia is that this relationship between the state and the people, right, the monarchy that tries to use different nationalities in various ways to make Russia into a great power, that imperial system played out differently in different places. This existed in multiple versions. And how this worked, how this played out in different places, you can see by following his movements. So the first place he arrives, as I said, is St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg, all right, let me back up for a moment. Russia had long been Europeans in Russia, right? That's not new. That is, the Russian government already in the 17th century was interested in trade with the Europeans. The Russian government was interested in European experts, like European officers would help command the Russian army. European engineers would help build fortifications. So the Russians had a long tradition of bringing in Europeans. But if you look at this image, this is obviously from the early 20th century, but it tries to capture what, the relationship between the Russian people and these foreigners. Here you have a group of Europeans arriving in distinctly European dress. And here you have this Russian man and woman. What are the man and woman thinking? Or what's the painter saying that the man and woman are thinking? Yes, sir.
There's like a suspicion.
Yeah, and I think especially from him, right, there's a view of, what he's carrying, by the way, is bagels. Right, bagels come from Eastern Europe. This is a version of bagels that he's got there. Right, he's clearly looking at that with suspicion. These are foreigners, they're infidels, right, they're not Orthodox. Who knows, we don't want to have any contact with them. What other feeling is there? I think if you look at her, how could you interpret it? I mean, one could interpret this in different ways. Yes, sir.
Like they don't approve of it.
Right. So I think there's disapproval. There's suspicion and disapproval. Mm-hmm.
She looks kind of like interested, like hanging back, like looking over his shoulder.
Yeah, that's how I would read it also. That there's also curiosity. These foreigners are exotic. They, maybe it'd be interesting to get to know them. And you can see she's hanging back. You have the feeling he's pulling her a little bit. And what the painter is clearly trying to evoke is this ambivalence in Russian culture in the 17th century about being curious about the West, but also being suspicious of it. And I suppose if you think of our time, that the relationship between the West and very conservative Muslim societies has similarities with this, right? That from the side of a conservative society that avoids not having contact with the outside, there's a mix of fear and curiosity. And that is very much how 17th century Russians viewed the West. This changes with Tsar Peter the Great. This is the most famous monument to Peter the Great. If you ever go to St. Petersburg, this is a must-see. Here you see him, and here you see him again. So Peter is Tsar of Russia around 1700. And Peter's vision is that if Russia is going to have a future as a great power, it has to become part of Europe, right? That the Russians have to aggressively embrace Europe. And one thing he does for that goal is to found St. Petersburg. So he founds St. Petersburg, and to understand St. Petersburg's character, you might think of a combination of Washington, D.C. and Hong Kong. Right? On the one hand, it's a brand new custom-made capital city. So the whole idea is we have this new Europeanized Russia. We'll build a new capital city to represent that. And secondly, we need a city that's going to be our contact place with the world, where foreign merchants are going to come, where we're going to have the most advanced schools, a place that's a showcase for our country, where foreigners come to see us. In that sense, like what Hong Kong might be for China, St. Petersburg becomes for Russia. So St. Petersburg is in some ways a completely unnatural place for Russia. But it's Washington, D.C. and Hong Kong rolled into one. And what happens here, this is now a painting of a street scene in St. Petersburg. One of the things that happens is you need a lot of foreigners to help make this work. Right? On the one hand, the Russian Empire needs foreigners to connect it with the West. So, for example, you need foreign merchants to come to Russia and do business, or foreign diplomats to come and represent their governments. So, on the one hand, they need foreigners to create connection, and on the other hand, they need foreigners to bring foreign skills. So, you need foreign engineers, and foreign doctors, and foreign army officers, and foreign generals to help command the Russian army, and so forth. So they need foreigners both to bring foreign skills to Russia and foreigners to create a connection between Russia and foreign countries. So by the time Rosenstock gets there, so by the time he gets there in 1804, something like 12% of the population of St. Petersburg was foreigners. So about 12% were foreigners, and of those 12%, 2/3 were Germans. So he, as a German, is a completely typical foreigner in St. Petersburg. In fact, St. Petersburg was one of the biggest German cities anywhere. Right? The German community of St. Petersburg was bigger than most towns in Germany itself. One consequence of the German community being so big is that they had their own theater. Right? This is the Imperial Palace. Opposite the square of the Imperial Palace is, in one of these buildings, I'm not sure which one, was a theater that ran all in German, basically for the German community. And that's why Rosenstock goes to St. Petersburg, to be an actor with that population. So initially he goes to be a part of the foreign community that connects Russia with Europe, right? That the German actors were coming through St. Petersburg all the time, just like merchants were, just like diplomats were. But then he, at one point, or by 1809, so he arrives in 1804. By 1809, he leaves the theater. He has various personal reasons for why he's tired of the theater. But also what happens is he finds a new career opportunity, which is, you remember, the Russians need foreigners not just to maintain a connection to Europe. They also need foreigners to help westernize Russian society itself. Right? That's why you have foreign officers in the Russian army or foreign professors at Russian universities. So among other things, they need a lot, to maintain the lifestyle of the Russian upper class, they need foreign goods. Like, have a look at these two groups of people. These three men are dressed in traditional Russian garb. These two men and two women are dressed in Western clothes. If you walk down the street in Russia, you could immediately tell who belongs to the westernized upper class and who is one of the non-westernized common people. So if you want to be a member of the Russian elite, and you want to be recognized as a member of the Russian elite, you can't go around wearing Russian clothes. You have to have Western consumer goods. I mean, if you were the equivalent of this in a non-Western country today, would have to have the Western clothes and the Western smartphone and so forth. You need the equivalent of that in the early 19th century. And somebody has to sell you that. And if you want to buy those things, well, Rosens opens up a store right there in that building. So he opens up a store in 1809 to sell Western luxury goods to upper-class Russians, on the theory that you have this enormous market of upper-class Russians who want to buy Western luxury goods, but he, as a German, has contacts in Germany. And so he's capable of importing goods and selling them. So he now becomes part of a different aspect of the Russian Empire, which is trying to westernize the Russian upper class itself. So this takes us from 1809 to 1811. Right? Those are the years when his shop is in that building right there. Now in 1811, he moves his business to Moscow. Oh, sorry, his shop would have looked probably kind of like this. I've never found an image of the shop. This is what high-end retail looked like in the years around 1800. So you have to imagine a shop more or less of that type is what he had in St. Petersburg. And in 1811, he moves his business to Moscow. So now he's going overland. You see where Moscow is located. This is a completely different place. Right? It's the first time, as far as I know, it's the first time that he leaves St. Petersburg. Right? St. Petersburg is mainly connected with Europe. If you're in St. Petersburg as a foreigner, right, you know foreigners who are coming from Europe, you know foreigners who are going back to Europe, you see the ships that are traveling between Europe and St. Petersburg. The area around St. Petersburg is sparsely settled. Basically, St. Petersburg is as far north as southern Alaska. Right? So you don't have a big farm population around it because the land or the climate is too harsh. So really, in a way, it's almost like being on an island. Certainly back then it would have been. In his mind, St. Petersburg would have been like an island at the end of a sea lane coming from Europe. That's how he would have pictured that in his mind. And he knew that outside the city limits there was this Russia, but he would have had no or almost no personal contact with that. That changes when he packs up in St. Petersburg and goes to Moscow. So going to Moscow introduces him with a second scenario of the Russian Empire, right? The second aspect of the Russian Empire that's very different from the first one. So the first one, remember, is St. Petersburg as this mix of Washington, D.C. as the political capital and Hong Kong as your place for dealing with outsiders, right? That's what he knows. He's now going to Moscow, and he would discover a couple of things. First of all, if you go from St. Petersburg to Moscow, you just go through lots and lots of empty, open countryside. Right? It's kind of like if you go from here to Kansas City. So, and if you look at how Russian painters painted the landscape of the Russian interior, it's as flat country with big skies and everything goes on and on and on. So one of the things you discover is this is an enormously big country. There's a big landmass in a way that you wouldn't appreciate if you're in St. Petersburg. A second thing is this is a land of serfdom. what you would find once you go into the Russian interior is most people are peasants, right? So a peasant is basically is simply a person who lives in the countryside. A peasant is somebody who lives by farming. Most people are peasants. They would live in settlements that look kind of like this village right here. And typically they are the possession of a noble family that would live in a place like this. And so you'll have one noble manor house, and the nobles who live in that manor house are these westernized nobles whom Rosenstrauch would have met in St. Petersburg. Right? In the summers, they go back out to their country houses. So that's who lives in the country house. And these people, all of these peasants who live in the villages, those are their serfs, and these are people who are culturally completely foreign to him. They don't speak any foreign languages, they don't wear Western clothes, they're completely alien to the culture that he's coming from. So for him, there's a small upper class that owns everybody else, and the small upper class, that's who he's connected with. So this is all, the closer you get to Moscow, the more it looks like this. In fact, if you look at this map right here, right, so this is St. Petersburg, that's Moscow. What I've shown in this bluish egg-shaped thing is more or less the ethnic heartland of Russia. In other words, the core area where lots of people lived and those people were ethnically Russian. Right? If you ask Russians, where is the heartland of Russia? Right? Where they're not Ukrainians and they're not Lithuanians and it's not just empty tundra, but where you come through land where everyone's Russians, is more or less this region here. Which means what you're seeing is Moscow is right smack in the middle of that. Where St. Petersburg is way off to the edge. Right? For St. Petersburg to be the capital is a bit as if Anchorage, Alaska were the capital of the United States. Whereas for Moscow is more like Chicago, right? Is in the middle of things as opposed to at the edge. So Moscow is right in the middle, and what that means concretely is for all of those nobles who are westernized people who live on those country estates that he would have passed through on the way, where they spend the winter, right? They usually hang out on their estates in the summer. You go out to the country, you go hunting, you go fishing, you picnic, you go horseback riding. You spend the summer in the country. But in the winter, it's dull and cold and so forth. So what you do in the winter is you come into Moscow, and one of the things you do in Moscow is you shop. And so there is a massive market of westernized, wealthy, upper-class Russians who would like to buy Western goods that they can take back to their country houses in the summer. And they're sitting in Moscow, and there's not that many foreigners in Moscow. And so that is what Rosenstrauch goes to Moscow to do. He opens up a shop that will sell the same luxury goods as in St. Petersburg to these Russians. So if you look at more broadly at this Russian heartland that's around Moscow, you have foreigners there in two different capacities. Right? One is you have foreigners who do in Moscow more or less what they did in St. Petersburg. Right? They're there as teachers and as doctors and as shopkeepers, and that's what Rosenstrauch does. But there's way fewer of them. There's way fewer than in St. Petersburg. The other type of foreigners you get mingle much more directly with the Russian nobility. So if you look at how life on a Russian country estate, right? Remember the nobles, those are the people who are his customers. You would have the owner, or here you have, she's the owner, and that owner of the estate has all kinds of servants. And some of these servants are Russian serfs, like these two maids right here, or the wet nurse who's taking care of the mistress's child. And some of these servants are foreigners. So these people are serfs, right? They belong to the owner. Others are hired foreigners, like this governess. Right? A governess would be hired to teach your children. So they learn to speak proper French, or they learn history, or whatever subjects you'd want them to know. So basically, the purpose of the foreigners in the Russian heartland is really to bring Western culture to the Russian upper class. Right? They're not there to create a connection between Russia and the West, like as merchants or as diplomats, like in St. Petersburg. They're there so that the Russian upper class can become Westernized in its way of living, so that Russian noble children can learn to speak French, so that their mom and dad can wear new Western clothes, so you can have Western books. And all of that is significant because those are the key status symbols for the Russian upper class. The way that you establish yourself as a member of the elite is by having those things. And so Rosenstrauch, once he's in Moscow, he is part of this project of westernizing the Russian upper class. And I should say, by the way, that what happens both in Petersburg and in Moscow, these two different kinds of foreign influences, these have an enormous long-term effect on Russian society. Right? Russia, after Peter the Great establishes St. Petersburg, Russia never becomes separate from Europe again. Russia always remains a European state with European alliances, close trade with European countries. If you take, say, in the modern Middle East, Iran before the Islamic Revolution of 1979, right? Iran was in many ways closely connected with the West. And then it broke that connection as a result of the Islamic Revolution. Russia never had that kind of moment. It always remained connected with the European system as a result of what happened in St. Petersburg. Similarly, if you look at this Westernization of the Russian upper class, some of that Westernization more and more filtered down to the rest of the population. And the result is that by the late 19th and especially the 20th century, the entire Russian population became culturally Western. The consequence of that is that there's never been a Russian Taliban. Right? Even after the revolution, even after the czars were overthrown, there was never a push to say women shouldn't go to school anymore, or men should grow beards again, or we should in any way go back to the 17th century. So the kind of the different kinds of Westernization that the Russian Empire promoted had really deep, long-lasting effects. So this is what Rosenstrauch is doing in Moscow. Now then so he becomes a wealthy merchant, right? He survives the fire. His business survives the fire of Moscow. He makes oodles of money afterwards, becomes one of the wealthiest merchants in the city. And eventually he has a religious epiphany. Now the man's a Lutheran, right? He has a religious epiphany and decides he wants to become a pastor. So in 1820, at the age of 52, he moves to what is now Ukraine and becomes a pastor. So he goes from Moscow first down to Odessa, and then eventually to Kharkov, which is the place that Dr. Westrate wrote his dissertation about. But you even looked up the church that had been his church, right? And I thought you met people who'd heard about him?
Absolutely.
I quote that in my book manuscript. So he goes to Ukraine and becomes a Lutheran pastor. I should say the whole time the man doesn't speak any Russian, or minimal Russian, right? So he's talking German with other Germans in the Russian Empire. So you wonder, how's that happen? Right? In the Russian Empire, how does a merchant go to be a German pastor in Ukraine and have a German congregation, and he doesn't have any divinity degree. How does that happen? So what happened here is this. And here we get to the third scenario of the Russian Empire that we've had after St. Petersburg and Moscow. If you look at this map, okay, so St. Petersburg is just up, if you can see where my pen is pointing. Moscow is about here, right? Both of those are in a region that's naturally covered by forest. Southern Russia, that is southern Russia and what's today Ukraine, this is the Black Sea here. The lands north of the Black Sea are steppe. What is a steppe? Any of you know that? Yes, sir.
It's incredibly flat grassland.
Yeah, above all, it's a grassland. Exactly, that's the key feature. It's a grassland. Think of the American prairies. If you think of the shift in land that you get in this country, if you go from Pennsylvania or Ohio or Kentucky, which are naturally forested, if you go to Kansas or Nebraska, which naturally don't have forests but are covered by grasslands, by prairies, that's basically what happens in Russia, but it doesn't happen going east to west, it happens going north to south. So if this up here is more Pennsylvania, this down here is more Nebraska in terms of the way it naturally looks. The Russians had conquered the steppe, the Black Sea steppe, in the late 1700s. In other words, they conquered it shortly before Rosenstrauch arrived there. The Black Sea steppe was very fertile. So this is like conquering Iowa or something like that. It's very fertile land. And once the Russians conquered the Black Sea coast, right, once they conquered the coast here, they could build ports and export grain. So essentially, you have to imagine grain can be grown up here, exported to the Black Sea coast, and then shipped to Europe and sold for big bucks, or big rubles. But that required people, right? And the Black Sea steppe was very sparsely settled. So the Russians had to find people somehow to go there. The Russians established a colonial regime in the area. The area, this is present-day Ukraine that you see here in kind of pink. These areas here were designated by the government as New Russia. And the term New Russia was picked in imitation of New England or New France, which was the French colonies in Canada, or New Spain, which is what we think of today as Mexico. So there's a way that European powers, when they created a colony, would often call it New whatever our country is. And when Catherine the Great in the late 18th century labeled all of this as New Russia, she was specifically saying this is a colonial space. This is our version of America. We're going to settle this. We're going to move colonists here, just like the Europeans are in the Americas. So whereas Moscow is in the ethnic Russian heartland, everybody there is Russian. They've all been Russian for centuries. New Russia is a completely different place. This is going to be a colonial space. This is incidentally part of the dispute today between Russians and Ukrainians over territory has its roots in this. There's to a lot of Russians down to this day, these parts of Ukraine don't really count as Ukrainian. Right? It's gotten stuck in the minds of many Russians that the lands that used to be so-called New Russia really have a connection with Russia, and the Ukrainians shouldn't have them. So when Russia annexed Crimea, and a lot of Russians were supportive of that, it's an outgrowth of these ideas from the 18th century. So anyhow, so the Russian government was interested in developing New Russia, and for that they thought, hey, we could bring in foreign immigrants, exactly like they do in the Americas. In particular, they draw lots of German immigrants, where the Russians had the idea that Germans are civilized people, so bringing in German immigrants will raise the level of civilization. Plus, Germany had a lot of people who wanted to emigrate. So this was a perfect meeting of two concerns. Basically, if you think of lots of Germans came to America in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And these are sort of essentially cousins of the same Germans. What you have is, on the one hand, peasants who didn't have land and whose goal was to be able to have a farm so they could have a livelihood. And secondly, religious minorities, especially Mennonites. So if you think of the Pennsylvania Dutch are the exact same religious community where basically one branch, or some of them packed up for America and ended up in Pennsylvania and Ohio, and some of them near where I live in Indiana, and the others moved east and went to Russia. But it's the exact same movement that pushed people in both directions. So this is a whole different type of European immigrant than the people Rosenstrauch met in Petersburg and Moscow. But in Petersburg and Moscow, he met merchants and doctors and army officers and people who worked with Russians, right? Governesses in Russian households, officers in Russian regiments, right? People whose job it is to help Russians learn Western skills. This is a whole different kind of European immigration, which is entire communities who are going to build complete German or other European villages in Russia to reproduce a Western way of life. So these people, for these people going to Russia, the distance they went was about, or the time it took to go to Russia was about the same time as how long it took to come here. So a boat going to America might take 10 or 15 weeks. An overland trek to Russia would take 10 or 15 weeks. So it felt as far away as America did. And it's more or less the same numbers of people. Right? There's more or less 100,000, give or take, Germans who ended up in America, Germans who ended up in the Austrian Empire. All these red dots here are German settlements. Right? This is Germany proper. That's Poland, which is then part of Russia. This is Russia proper. This is the Black Sea. This is the Austrian Empire. So a lot of the Germans ended up in the Austrian Empire, and a lot more ended up in all of these red spots here in the Russian Empire. Now, these people established settlements. A lot of these settlements were fairly rough places. If you think of frontier settlements in America, they had all the same problems. And the Russian government had the idea that we have to bring order to these people. Right? Russia is an authoritarian state with a disciplined social system. Somebody needs to exercise authority. A lot of these people are religious. They need ministers. They tried to hire normal Protestant ministers. Most of these are Protestants. They tried to hire normal Protestant ministers, but not many wanted to go to these remote frontier outposts. So the Russian government basically started hiring pretty much anyone who was willing to acquire the knowledge to be a pastor and was willing to make the effort, and that's how Rosens manages to become a pastor, because of these frontier conditions. It's as if I had was my great-great-grandfather, I think, was a Protestant minister in Kansas in the 1880s, and he came from Wales, and he was a saddler by profession. So by profession, he made saddles and harnesses and so forth. But there were lots of Welsh coal miners who settled in a coal mining community in Kansas. They needed ministers, and evidently regular ministers didn't want to go there or they couldn't be paid. But a guy who was a saddler could take a crash course and become their minister. And Rosenstrauch's story must have been somewhat like that. So he goes to Ukraine and ends up living there as a pastor for the rest of his life until he dies in 1835. So up to now, there's a certain similarity with what you see in the Americas, right? Especially this kind of colonization is like the American West. But what happens then is there's no more mass immigration to Russia after the 1820s. So the Russians cut off the foreign settlement, new foreign settlement in New Russia after the 1820s. Russia never becomes a big immigration place in the 19th century, whereas all the big European immigration mostly goes west across the Atlantic. It doesn't go to Russia. And if you look at Rosenstrauch's own family, his descendants become culturally Russianized in the 19th century. And so there's a question of what happened here, right? How did Russia wind up going in a somewhat different direction than, say, the United States did? Now, I think there's two reasons why Russia went in that different direction. One reason is simply their political system. Okay, Russia had obviously much, much more authoritarian system than the United States or than other countries in the Western Hemisphere. And that meant that the Russian government could simply cut off foreign immigration if they thought immigrants were troublesome. Right? In the United States, there's much more of a free-for-all, that if frontier communities in the West were kind of rough, that didn't stop anyone on the East Coast from letting immigrants in. In the Russian case, there's a single governmental authority that did put an end to immigration when they thought that many of the frontier settlements were too difficult. But it's not just that. What happens in Russia is that Russia in the 19th century is trying to turn from an empire into a nation. And this is the same time that the United States was becoming a nation, but they became nations in different ways. And broadly, here's what I want to say. So scholars who study nations, right? Nations are a modern concept. That is, nation meaning a country where we assume that there's a bond among the people. That's not just that you're the subject of a king, but you somehow have a connection with the other people of the country, right? And that's what holds the country together. That's a modern concept. Now, scholars distinguish two types of nations, or two models of nation. One is what's called a civic nation. And civic nationalism is if what makes you a member of the nation is that you are willing to be a citizen and share in the ideals of the state. So in America, when Americans talk about being a country where people of different backgrounds all support democracy and all support the Constitution, that's civic nationalism for you. The other version is what's called ethnic nationalism. Ethnic nationalism is that we form a community because we all have the same heritage. So for instance, I could become a Canadian, probably. If I moved to Canada and could convince them that I'm willing to be a good Canadian citizen and I'm willing to take part in your society, I could become a Canadian. I could never become an Italian American, right? I'm not of Italian background, and what makes you Italian American is the Italian heritage, right? You can't say, oh, I would like to become one, right? So what you have, so the United States or Canada or Argentina, right? These are the big immigration countries in the West. They defined themselves as civic nations in the 19th century. So the assumption is people immigrate. Each person who immigrates, each white person, there's always a racial component to this, but basically each white person has basically the same rights and the same duties. And you are now a new individual American or Canadian or Argentinian. And what that encourages is people integrating and people assimilating, because the state treats everybody more or less the same. The Russians had a moment when they toyed with a kind of civic nationalism idea. And that is this. Like, if you look at this, is a picture from the 18th century. It's an allegory, and it represents the Russian Empire as this neatly tended landscape. And here you have Empress Catherine II with symbols of truth and justice, who is managing this neatly tended garden. So there's a certain, the reason I'm putting that up is there was a tradition in the Russian Empire of thinking that the Russian Empire is really a single community of peoples who all share a bond because they're all supporting the monarchy. And they're all supporting the monarchy and trying to make Russia into a great European country. And in that sense, you could see there's a time in the late 18th century when the word Russian meant something from the Russian Empire. And a person from the Russian Empire who spoke Russian, and one who spoke German, and one who spoke Polish could all be called Russian, because after all, it's the empire that made you Russian, right? So there's a time in the 18th and early 19th century when it looked like Russia might be evolving in that direction, that what makes you Russian is membership in the empire. And that would suggest that this could all have gone in the kind of direction that the countries in the Americas did. But then that's not how it worked out. And it didn't work out that way for a couple of reasons. One is that if you look at how the Russian Empire operated, where the Russian Empire never treated all people as identical to each other. So first of all, the Russian Empire always divided the population into what are called estates. An estate is a group in society that has separate rights and duties from other groups. So you are legally a member of this group. You're legally a member because that's what your parents were, so you don't have a choice in the matter. And based on which group you're in, you have rights and duties. So here in 1912, these images kind of show you what men in those groups might have looked like, but also their relative significance. So for example, out of every 1,000 inhabitants, 771 were legally peasants, 106 belonged to the urban lower class. Down here, 10 out of every 1,000 were nobles. 5 out of every 1,000 were members of the clergy. But what that shows is that even in 1912, it's still very much that every person belongs to some category. And so there's no such thing as just the rights and duties of a Russian person. There's the rights and duties of a peasant, or the rights and duties of a person of the lower middle class. The same way, there's not just the status of a person at Villanova, right? You're an undergraduate, you're a graduate student, you're a professor, you're a member of the administration, you're a staff member. Each one of those has a separate status. It's not like there's one status of just a person here. And the Russian Empire operated on that principle. Moreover, the Russian Empire did not legally recognize ethnicities, right? So they didn't care what ethnicity you were, but they did care about your religion. So your religion was part of your legal identity. So 65% of the population was defined as Russian. That's what this means. But what that means is 65% are Russian Orthodox, are members of the Orthodox Church. 10% are various Muslims. 6% here are Poles, but that probably means mainly that they're Catholic. 3.9% are Jews. You see here 1.6% are Germans. So the Russian Empire, and if you look at religion, different religious communities had different rights and duties. So for example, a Catholic could convert to Orthodoxy, but an Orthodox person could not convert to Catholicism. A Jew could convert to any kind of Christianity, but no Christian could ever convert legally to Judaism. If I was Orthodox and you were Catholic and we got married, our children would have to be Orthodox because Orthodoxy had higher rights. In other words, the Russian government treated its religious communities separately in the same way that it treated its social estates separately. And that means that they never fused together in the way that at least the white populations did in the United States or in Canada. Let me skip over something here. What you have in addition, now in a normal colonial, normal in quotation marks, colonial empire, you would have a dominant nationality, right? So clearly people from Britain were dominant in the British Empire. The Russian Empire wasn't like this, because the whole point of the Russian Empire was for Russia to become like Europe. So what develops is a movement hostile to the empire among ethnic Russians, right? Ethnic Russians who are saying, we Russians are being oppressed. Like, you have a look at this painting right here. What this painting shows is two noblemen bargaining over this serf woman. She's supposed to be sold. And one of them is selling her to the other, and they're arguing about the price. And here the other serfs, either they're watching or maybe they're part of the package being sold. What do you notice about their clothes? If you compare his clothes with hers,
Just like the difference in colors that like she's wearing versus like she's wearing like darker colors and she's wearing more of like a uniform similar to what all the other.
yeah, and what part of the world do these clothes come from?
They're definitely European.
Right, these are the same clothes that any European or American man of the status would wear. How about her clothes?
Russian.
Yeah, any Russian looking at this would say the people on this picture who are actually Russian, who have Russian written all over them, are the people being bought and sold. The people who are doing the buying and selling are imitation Westerners. So yes, these are the Russian upper classes, right? The people making the painting and buying the painting come from these classes. But they look at that and say, there's something wrong with this system, where our nationality gets treated like dirt by an upper class that's trying really hard to be foreign. So what develops is a Russian nationalism that is in many ways opposed to the empire. Because what the Russian nationalists are saying is the people who run the empire, right, the czars and their officials, what those people are doing is they're trying to make us like foreigners. In order to make us like foreigners, they're oppressing our own people, and they're giving high status to foreign immigrants. Right? Someone like Rosens shows up and he's German, so automatically he gets treated well. People like these Russian peasants who are actually Russian get treated poorly. There's something fundamentally wrong with this. So the Russian Empire comes under criticism, not only from the oppressed, from let's say the minority ethnic groups, or from the lower classes, but also from people who represent the dominant ethnic group in the country. And here, if you want to think of a modern counterpart, think of the English nationalism that was behind the Brexit movement, which is basically people saying we are the dominant English nationality and our upper class doesn't care about us. They care about this international European Union. Or a lot of the sentiment behind President Trump's election by people who feel like we are the, quote, real Americans, but we're being used by an elite that wants globalization. Right? There's much the same kind of sentiment is going on in the Russian Empire. So the Russian Empire is being criticized both from non-Russian groups who feel oppressed and from Russians who feel that the rights of Russians are not being respected. This ultimately leads to the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917. And it has a legacy, and that's the last point I want to make today. The legacy today in the world of Vladimir Putin is these two different conceptions of what Russia is about and what Russianness is about. And the one conception is that what Russianness is about is the Russian people. Right? If you think of the image of the serfs being sold, there's an image that what Russianness is about is the Russian people, and globalization, imitating foreigners, connections with other countries, all of that is bad because it damages the integrity of our people. Right? That's the one conception, and that's what ideologically is what makes the Russian government sympathetic to all the nationalist populists in other countries. But then the other conception of what ethnicity means in Russia is the tradition of the Russian Empire. Right? Russia as a great power with people of different ethnic backgrounds, and that everyone can be accepted as long as they support a strong Russian state. And so that's why the same Vladimir Putin, who had the mosque and the synagogue built at Victory Park, is the same one who supports the nationalist populists in the West. And I will leave it at that. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to entertain any questions you might have. Yes, ma'am.
Was the ambivalence towards migration in the 17th century, was that directly influenced by Peter the Great and his desire to expand and open doors to Europe? Or like, did that come about before or after? Or, like, did he have anything to do with it?
I mean, the original ambivalence is before. That in a sense, Peter is the response to it. Right? So the original issue was basically that the Russian government realized that if Russia was going to be a big power and not be overwhelmed by its Western neighbors, it needed military and engineering skills that they could only get from Westerners. So you had to bring in Western experts. So for example, put Western officers in charge of Russian army units. On the other hand, at that time, there was a deep religious split between Orthodox Russians and non-Orthodox Westerners. And just the cultures were really different. So most Russians, or a lot of Russians, really resented all of these Westerners who were infidels from a Russian perspective being put in positions of authority in Russia. And so there was a tension between the need for foreign expertise and the resentment against it. Peter the Great's solution to that was to say, we're not going to have the resentment anymore if we ourselves become Western. So if the Russian upper class becomes Western, then they will feel a connection with the West, and they're not going to feel like a Westerner is foreign to them anymore. The consequence, of course, then was that to some degree the Russian lower classes became foreign to the Russian upper classes. Right? The more the Russian upper classes began behaving and thinking like Westerners, the less they behaved and thought like their own lower classes. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
But so Peter was basically trying to respond to that resentment. Yes, sir?
I have a feeling the answer has something to do with World War II, but why was this significant German population? What happened?
World War II has a lot well, a couple of things have to do with it. One, there's an image that I skipped because I wasn't going to have the time for it, but there were two groups of Russian. Traditionally, some of the Germans in Russia had special privileges. So one group are the Baltic Germans, basically the upper class of what's now Estonia and Latvia, were ethnic Germans. So both the merchants in the towns and the nobles who governed the peasantry, right? They were Germans, while the lower classes were Estonians and Latvians. And the Russian government allowed them basically to govern those provinces. So Estonia and Latvia were governed as quasi-German places by Germans in the Russian Empire. A second group are German peasant immigrants, particularly Mennonites, who were given long-term exemptions from military service and certain taxes if they settled in Russia. What happens in the late 19th century is basically the Russian government comes under pressure from the nationalists. Russian nationalists who said, these Russian peasants have to pay taxes and have to serve in the army. How come these German Mennonites don't? Right? How come these German nobles are ruling Russian provinces? And so the Russian government abolished a lot of those special rights. That meant the Baltic Germans were really unhappy, but they couldn't do anything. A lot of the Mennonites packed up and left. And so this image of here is of Mennonite settlers in Kansas in the 1870s. So there's a whole ethnic phenomenon in America of German Americans from Russia. If you Google that, you'll see there's a whole internet world about German Americans from Russia, because you had basically Mennonites who left Russia in the late 19th century to settle on the Great Plains and in Canada. Now, a lot of Germans then stayed behind. Many of them were basically forced to assimilate in the First World War because there's massive anti-German sentiment. And then, you're right, you have the Second World War. And what happened in the Second World War is partly the Nazis viewed, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, the Nazis viewed the ethnic Germans as natural allies. And some of them welcomed the German invasion, and then had to flee when the Germans left. And and in addition, the ethnic Germans were treated as automatic suspects by the Soviet government. So a lot of ethnic Germans were deported to Central Asia. And between people being deported by the Soviets to Central Asia, people fleeing to Germany with the German army, the coherent German communities in Russia basically disappeared in the Second World War period. So yes, exactly. Once you had the Second World War, being an ethnic German who's Russian but also German, there's no way to make those two things work together. Yes?
So, well, thank you for an excellent presentation. I want to just ask you, in terms of this development of nationalism and the changing nationalism in the 19th century, what role do you see being played by, say, certain things like the Polish uprising or the nationalist movements in other parts of Europe in the shift that you're talking about?
I think they had a lot to do with it. That is, here, if you look at what triggers the development of Russian nationalism, partly, I mean, the aspect that I focused on was Russian nationalists reacting to what they thought was the injustice of Russia's own political and social system. But there's partly a copycat effect in relation to Western Europe, that is similar movements went on in much of the rest of Europe. So if you look at there was a big nationalist movement in Ireland to separate Ireland from Great Britain. There are ones in different parts of the Austrian Empire to separate Hungary, for example, from Austria. What you had in Germany and Italy is Germany and Italy were divided into many different states. And the nationalists there wanted to unify all this into one country. But there was a feeling in a lot of places, that in many different countries you had basically this feeling that the reason our society is unfair, and people always think their society is unfair, right? This is part of life. But the reason our society is unfair is because our government does not reflect our traditions as a people. Right? The government doesn't think the way we as a people think, so we need a government that reflects our national way of thinking about things and our national values. And that was, if you talk to anybody in Europe in the 1840s or 1850s, you heard those ideas, and the Russians did too. So partly these ideas were just in the air at the time. But then the other element is that the Russians felt under attack, because a lot of this nationalism is, basically nationalism originally is about changing your own society. But pretty quickly it can also become about who are our enemies, right? Who are the outsiders who are preventing us from being our true selves. And in Poland in particular, that became the Russians, right? A lot of Poland was governed by Russia. And so Polish nationalists felt that Russia was the enemy. And a lot of areas that were not Polish ethnically were areas that Polish nationalists thought should be Polish. So there's a serious dispute between Polish and Russian nationalists over whether Poland should be part of Russia, whether Poland should have these areas that Russians considered Russian. And there was one big Polish uprising in 1831, another big one in 1863, and that brought out a lot of hostility by Russian nationalists who felt that Russia is being attacked by foreigners, and so we ethnic Russians have to stand together. So that was a powerful factor. And what's related to that then is that other Europeans increasingly treated Russia as a threat. So for example, when all of Germany was united in 1871, and for a lot of German nationalists, Russia was, to them, was a hostile country. So there's a way in which the growth of nationalism in one country would drive the growth of nationalism in another country. Because if they declare us to be the enemy, then we have to push back. So that would be my response to that. Yes, sir, Dr. Westright.
Thank you for the great presentation. There are half a dozen of my students in the room taking Suffering and Progress in the 20th Century, and they read Ernst Renan just a little over a week ago. To what extent I really appreciated, for their sake and mine, this distinction you made between civic nationalism and, for lack of a better term, imperial nationalism. But could you speak a little bit more about the distinctions maybe between French nationalism, U.S. nationalism, and Russian nationalism at that time? I know it's a big question.
Yeah, Let me think about this for a moment. Sometimes the easiest thing is to start talking and then try to think while you're talking, but sometimes that's hard to do. So I think the first thing is if you distinguish between different types of nationalism, the reality is every society has a mix of different types, right? So they're useful concepts, but in real life, the same society will combine different kinds of elements. But the basic pattern, I think, of American nationalism is the idea that the United States is a new country. What gives the United States its character is the future that we're trying to create. And the future is something about freedom and prosperity and so forth. And therefore, what makes you American is a willingness to be part of that. Now, that's not all there is to it. Most people would agree that part of being American is speaking English, is sharing in certain ways of behaving that we've inherited from the past. So there is a historical component to American nationalism, but it's above all oriented toward the future. The French have historically been divided between two different schools of thought. Right? What you had in France, basically France, as you know, was a monarchy until the Revolution of 1789, and the French revolutionaries tried to establish a model of nationalism of the American type. That is that France is a republic. What makes you a true French person is your willingness to be part of the republic and to promote the Republican way of living. There was massive pushback against that from the people who were opposed to the revolution, right, who never liked the revolution to begin with. They hated this whole Republican model. And those people said, what makes French people French is that we're Catholic. We've inherited 1,000 years of French culture. We have a French way of living. We have the tradition of our French kings. So the French produced these two different models of nationalism. And a lot of the conflicts in modern French culture modern French politics have to do with what do you think being French is all about? Is being French being the heir of French traditions, or is it creating a revolutionary republic? What you have in Russia are these two models, I think, of the empire and the nation. So the Russian empire model, in a certain way, is closer to the American model. It's authoritarian, right? It's not democratic, but it's closer to the American model because it says we are trying to build something, which is this great, powerful Russian state. And you might be Muslim, you might be Jewish, you might be an immigrant. If you're willing to be part of building this great Russian state, then you can be one of us. And there's the other version, which is ethnic, and that is to be Russian, is to be Slavic, is to be Orthodox, is to be connected with Russian folk traditions. And at that point, no, you can't really join that because you have to have inherited that. So I think, and frankly, the United States has elements of that too, right? Is this an Anglo-Saxon country? Is this a white country? Is this a country with roots in colonial traditions? I mean, there's that kind of element in American thinking also. So I think often what you'll have in countries is one version might be dominant, but actually different elements mix. And you can find American nationalists who lean toward the Russian Empire model and American nationalists who lean toward the ethnicity model. And that's often a useful way of thinking of it, I think.